Good evening. This is Texas History in the Nighttime. This is your professor, Nathan Gieselschlag. And if we were on the radio, we'd be getting out the tinfoil hats at this point and having discussions about aliens. But to know tonight, in the comfort of my own lazy boy in my own beautiful house in beautiful Snook, Texas, we are going to discuss Texas history. Just to give you a little update, everything is fine with Miss Gloria, and we'll see you on Monday. No problems, and for that Thanksgiving week. Hopefully, my eyes won't fall from the camera. Occasionally, I'll look down at the screen which I'm lecturing to, or right below. So, anyways, about where we left off last time, I think we had Jackson rampaging through Pensacola, Florida, and tearing up Florida and making a mess of the whole situation down that part of the world. So the United States through the Adams-Onis Treaty pick up Heaven's Waiting Room, as I've always liked to call it. That's that. Jackson's star continues to rise, but I think it's worth mentioning now a new person into the equation. In fact, actually, I mentioned him last time. Probably said something to the effect that John Quincy Adams was a great Secretary of State, but a pretty bad president. And I think that's still about right. His greatness as a Secretary of State extends in beyond the stuff with Florida. Not only does he extend the situation with Florida, take care of Florida, but he also, it's through his handiwork. The United States is able to extend that northern boundary from the Lake of the Woods up in Minnesota, basically all the way down to more or less Washington State. That's a little short, loose and fast, but the point is that he was able to protect what will eventually become the Western United States and prevent the Russians from establishing some sort of base or bay or whatever on the west coast of North America. So, anyways, Adams is big for that, and of course, his most famous thing, if you really know your American history, is the Monroe Doctrine. Now, he doesn't have any hands in that in the sense that it's not on his name, but he has all the activity with it. With regard to the Monroe Doctrine, basically, which says that the Europeans can no longer colonize in North America. Probably said better, new colonies in North America. That would be more accurate. Old Adams is going to get the assistance of the British. They're going to throw their weight behind it. And remember, the time we're discussing here in the early 1820s with Adams, before he's president, you're talking about a man or rather, you're talking about a time period, not a man, but you're talking about a time period in which you have all those Spanish colonies that are starting to break away and fly the coop. The British are all too happy to trade with those, and so that's to their advantage and to their interest. And so the United States and the British, no more, frankly, less than 10 years after you get done with the war, are working together for economic benefits and such. And so the United States establishes itself as the premier, or is attempting to establish itself as the premier nation in North America and, frankly, the Western Hemisphere. And so that's all to Adams's favor. And it being he is the Secretary of State, the next part of the story here is that Adams would be the presumptive nominee for the next presidency. In 1824, politically, there is no political party in the United States. The Federalists, to give you a very brief rundown, the Federalists were one of the original political parties, and they died in the aftermath of the War of 1812. They were not strong before, and the war killed them off. The Democratic Republicans, as they're called, sometimes you hear them referred to as the Republicans or Republican Democrats or whatever. It doesn't matter to me. It's Jefferson's party and later Jackson's party. They're going to have to be the only game in town. And so, in a sense, when you have one party, you still have a bunch of candidates going to run. In 1824, one of the more contentious elections in the history of the United States takes place. You're going to have five men, count them up, five, who are going to run for president of the United States. The first one, of course, we've talked a whole lot about him and his efforts, is a fellow named Andrew Jackson. Needs no introduction, but I would say this. Andrew Jackson is a man of the West. And so if you're trying to pin him up and pin him down, and really for the election of 1824, you need to know kind of where these people come from. What are their geographical centers? Where are their bases of support? 1824, Jackson's support is found, of course, in Tennessee and in the West. Many Westerners still appreciate what he did as the hero of New Orleans. Of course, that's his new nickname or one of his nicknames. In addition to that, you're also going to have others speak very highly of him. Um, as far as Jackson is concerned, in 1824, his while Westerners love him, Jackson in 1824 is not going to be loved by everyone out east. In fact, one of the men who will eventually run for president of the United States himself, a guy named Henry Clay, who's also a big character in this time period we're discussing. Clay himself said, "I don't understand how killing 5,000 British qualifies anybody for presidents of the United States." The fact is that Jackson didn't kill that many people. He didn't kill them all himself, of course, either. But it does say this is that not everybody thought winning a battle at New Orleans qualifies you to be president of the United States. So number one is Andrew Jackson. Number two is John Quincy Adams. I might put this on the final. I might not. I don't know. But I will say is that historically one of the great stepping stones in the United States to the presidency. You want to be president, go take this, become Secretary of State, and that will be the stepping stone to the presidency, especially early on. And in a sense, right now, you actually see this a little bit with Hillary Clinton. Perhaps this will date this lecture a little bit because if I end up ever using it again, I'd probably have to cut this out. But when Hillary Clinton runs, one of the things she'll say, and is saying already, is that I have experience with foreign policy because of my time as Secretary of State. It is the premier, in a sense, the senior position in the cabinet, the president. So whoever in this time period we're discussing as Secretary of State is going to be the next president potentially. So we have that. And by the way, Adams is really an Easterner. He's from Massachusetts. He is also, I should probably say all this too. His biography is absolutely sterling. I mean, not only is he Secretary of State and a great one, he has extensive experience living and working and being posted in Europe. He's a Russian diplomat to the court of Russia, the Tsar of Russia. He's also, I believe, in Holland. May have spent some time in England as well. Point is that he knows where the proverbial bodies are buried in diplomacy of the 1810s and 20s. And diplomacy still matters a lot in that time period. The United States trying to come up, the Monroe Doctrine. This guy is really, really good. And he's brilliant. I've got to say this. I'm not a particular fan historically of John Quincy Adams, but he is a brilliant man. No two ways about it. And his pedigree is even good, too. His father is the founding father, John Adams. So you put it all together, this guy is probably the presumptive favorite in 1824. So John Quincy Adams is an Easterner, and that's that. The next man up is a fellow named William Crawford. William Crawford. Just a simple English name, so nothing exciting about that. William Crawford is, if my memory is correct, is from Virginia, and more particularly, Crawford is Secretary of the Treasury under James Monroe. I remind you about this fact too. Is that while the Secretary of State slot is the premier stepping stone, as you'd expect or should understand, anybody who handles the money or knows where all the money is going to be an important person, whether it's in England with the Chancellor of the Exchequer or in the United States, which is Secretary of the Treasury. Some of the most powerful men in American history have served in the Treasury Secretary slot, or as later on, say, the Federal Reserve Chairman. But when you deal with money, you become very important, and everybody wants to know who you are. So all that put together is William Crawford, in his own right, in his own time, is a very formidable man. Uh, but fate and maybe not fate. That's probably too gauzy. Certainly, his health is going to conspire against him, and it'll ultimately hurt him. But had he lived, or rather, had he been a viable candidate for president, he probably would have made a good one. The fourth man to run for president in 1824 is a guy named Henry Clay. His nickname was Harry of the West. He is a dashing figure. He is also a large character in the time period we're discussing in American history. So Henry Clay is going to be very influential to the issue of Texas. Whether it's here in the first part with regard to the controversy of 1824 and 1828, later on Henry Clay is going to not only be controversial then, but in 1844 when he runs for president, he is also going to weigh in on the Texas issue. Henry Clay is from Kentucky. He too is a Westerner, but he has spent time overseas. He is a bit of a diplomat. He's been Speaker of the House. He is actually, you might ought to write that down. He is Speaker of the House of the United States, the House of Representatives, the United States House of Representatives. Get that right. Clay does cut a fairly dashing figure. What's interesting about him later on in life is that memory serves as he gets married about 72, 71. His wife had been dead and got widowed and all. He married a woman much younger than he was, and well, he was a daddy at about age 72. By the way, Jackson and Clay will not like each other. They will be, frankly, mortal enemies. So that's some previews for the time to come. And for all intents and purposes, especially in the 1830s and 1840s, Clay will be generally opposed to the expansion of the United States that would include Texas. So Clay's a major character when you talk about Texas annexation, Texas expansion, what have you. So if you ever get to really doing some reading on the subject, you'll either read on Clay, particularly this annexation period or the Revolutionary period. You'll read a lot about Clay. His fingerprints are everywhere. Sometimes they also called him not just Harry of the West, they also called him the Great Compromiser. So that is true for all of what you want to say there. Next up, number 4, number 5. So the fifth person on our list would be a fellow from South Carolina who was Secretary of War under James Monroe. And that man is John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun. Calhoun is he's a controversial figure, like Jackson is, and frankly, a lot of these people are in this time period. Calhoun, when he was older, somebody, I think it was a Brit, said that Calhoun's face, well, said he had a cast iron face. He was the man with a cast iron face. So, I mean, if you want to think about your lodge cast iron skillets plastered on his face, go right ahead. But actually, there are quite a few pictures of him when he was younger. You see the photographs when he's an old man, and he does look like a haggard old fella. But when he's much younger, oh, he evidently was quite the head turner, and his face was not of cast iron, but it was quite attractive. Problem for Calhoun is that he recognizes early on that he's not going to be president of the United States. He's not going to get it this time in 1824. Perhaps later, but not in 1824. So, sometimes the better part of valor is knowing when to fight and when not to fight, and when to withdraw and fight another day. And for Calhoun, he pulls out of the 24 election and he basically puts out the feelers that I'm John Calhoun. I'm respected. Generally speaking, I've done a good job as Secretary of War. I know my way around the block in Washington a little bit. I'll be glad to serve as Vice President. And to give you an idea how worthless the Vice Presidency was at that time, that nobody really wanted, nobody asked for it. Basically, as I've read the history, as best I can tell, is that Calhoun put his hand up and everybody said he'd make a decent one, whatever a decent vice president looks like. Is he crazy? No. Is he a crank? No. Is he a loon? No. Is he on death's doorstep? No. Heck, let him have it. So Calhoun's the vice president in 1824. You really don't have that party ticket system that you might think of today. It's not. It's there, yes, but it's not really in the same vein. So Calhoun, if you're making a list of all these names, Calhoun struck out. You wrote him down. He ran for president. Figured out he couldn't get it. Now he's the vice president. Strike him out. Now, the next thing to remember about American politics in the 1820s is you do not have a unified election system. You're not going to go to the poll on one day in November and everybody votes, blah, blah, blah. What you'll have is a series of elections and a series of votes and a series of ways even in this time period. So over the span of a month or two, maybe a little longer actually, you're going to have votes and announcements come back from the handful of states that are around in 1824. And remember this too, not a lot of people actually vote for the president. I mean, technically, I grant you, no one votes directly for the president, but in a sense, you really do when you go and you vote for the electors. And if you remember your U.S. government from either a blend class or a high school history class, a high school government class, you remember the electoral college is actually what elects the president and the vice president. So the electoral college is there, and if you read the Constitution closely, it says the legislatures of the states can dictate and determine how those electors shall be chosen. Today, basically, pretty much all the states have said that the electors shall be chosen through a ballot, the vote that we've all very familiar with, and some of you will get to vote for the first time in a presidential election in 2016. But so that all said, but in 1824, that wasn't the case. In fact, most of the people in 1824 did not vote. Women did not vote. Slaves did not vote. In fact, a lot of folks did not vote. Just landholders perhaps voted. In some states like South Carolina, the legislature themselves said, "We'll choose the elector. We'll vote for our own guy, whoever we think best." And so that's kind of the background of the story there. So the election happens. The returns slowly but surely over muddy roads and hilly valleys and hilly dales. I don't even know what a dale is anymore. But long and the short of it is that you come to find out that Andrew Jackson came in number one in the popular vote, which, as I just said, wasn't that big of nearly as big of a deal as it is today. And number two, Jackson also comes in number one in the Electoral College. After that, as you're writing this down and you're paying attention, number two on the pecking order was John Quincy Adams. Number three was William Crawford. Number four was Henry Clay. And that's how it washes out in the all important Electoral College. Well, the Electoral College also, or rather the Constitution says that in order to be elected president, the Electoral College must present somebody with a majority of the electoral votes. Today, that's 271 or 270 to get elected. The problem is that Jackson, though he had the most electoral votes, the vote was split amongst all those men. He only had a plurality. He did not have a majority. So when that happens, the Constitution then calls for a runoff election in the House of Representatives. The way it works is that the House of Representatives then votes via the state. So each state gets one vote in the House, if I'm remembering all my constitutional stuff right, and I'm pretty certain I am. The House votes vote per state, and they choose amongst the top three vote getters. So you can go ahead now and scratch through Henry Clay. So the top three vote getters, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford, are going to be chosen from by the House of Representatives. Well, here's that health issue for Crawford now. Crawford is going to get sick, and it probably was a stroke. If it wasn't a stroke, it was, what did I think they call it, TMI or PMI or whatever, but it's that precursor to a stroke. He was knocked out by it. He didn't get killed by it. And in fact, I think he lives another 10 years or so. You can check on that. But it effectively renders him mute and bedridden, and he cannot, he can't function as president. A lot of his supporters said, "Hey, wait a second. If he can't talk, that's not a bad thing. It may make him a better president." But he was effectively disqualified because of his health. So you can go and stretch William Crawford out. So now you're down to two people, Jackson and Adams, in the House of Representatives. So if we were in class, I'd ask you the next question is, who's going to be the kingmaker? Who's going to get to really have the power to choose the president of the United States? Who in the House of Representatives has the ability to influence who the members are going to choose? And your answer, of course, is the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker of the House is Henry Clay. So this ain't Sunday school, and this ain't a civics class where we're going to do it this way, and we're going to have issues, and we're going to talk about the people, and going to make it all right and good. Nah, if you're Henry Clay and you want to be president, that man slobbered over the idea him being president. You tell me, what does he want? How can he become president if he's Henry Clay and he really truly wants to be president? What's the best office he can ask for in exchange for his support to become for the man who will be president? What should he ask for? And the answer, of course, is he asks for and receives the Secretary of State slot. Evidently, Adams and Clay sat down and had a meeting one evening. It was in D.C. Frankly, neither man, to the best of my knowledge, neither man wrote down and left a diary for posterity. He said, tonight we dined on oysters and fricassee of rabbit, and decided to quid pro quo, 1 for 1, and trade off the Secretary of State slot for his support. Frankly, they may have talked about the weather. They may have talked about their dogs and wives and family. They may have talked about that very thing, the Secretary of State slot. I really don't know. Nobody knows except them and God. And but we do know what came out of it. When they came out, Henry Clay announced his support for Adams, and then later on, Adams nominates Henry Clay for the Secretary of State slot. You may be wondering, why didn't Adams and Jackson get into bed together politically? Well, frankly, the reason they did not start playing footsie with each other is because Adams and basically thought Jackson was a wild man, a Caesar potentially in the making. In addition to that, kind of like Clay said, how on earth does killing X amount of British soldiers qualify anyone to be president of the United States? Jackson is not somebody to be trusted near power, according to Adams and the Eastern elite, and so it was a natural thing, for Adams and Clay to make book together. Like I said, Clay didn't like Jackson either, so Jackson's kind of the man out in the cold. Jackson thinks he had just had the election stolen from him. In a sense, he kind of claimed that, I guess. Uh, if that's the case, and this is really, I think, politics, but Jackson he had a righteous streak in him. I like the man, but he did have a righteous streak in him when he thought somebody went against him. Anyways, it's called the corrupt bargain election of 1824. The corrupt bargain election of 1824. Jackson said he'd had the election stolen from him. In fact, Jackson took to calling Henry Clay the Judas of the West, and that for those 30 pieces of silver, just like Judas, he would hang for it as well. He hung himself politically for it, and he would never be president of the United States. Andrew Jackson was a lot of things, but he was pretty dang sharp politically. He was a smart man politically, and he was ultimately right. Clay would never be president of the United States. He came close, but never was president. So, anyways, Adams's election in 1824, now 25, because that's when you take the oath of office. Adams should have been a great president. I mean, quite honestly, if and this is something I'll teach you now. I say it in every class, and I'll say it to the others face to face in the next couple of days. Is that if you get into the ballot box and you get in there to vote, I honestly am not convinced that just because somebody's the smartest man and has the biggest resume and all that stuff is going to guarantee you to be a great president. And neither am I conversely convinced that if you have a short resume and you may not be the smartest person will make you a great president either, or a bad president. I think there are other factors involved. Some of the great presidents were never accused, at least prior to being president, of being smart. In fact, I'll use Lincoln. In fact, while he was president, Lincoln was called, amongst other things, the great Abraham Lincoln, Saint Abraham the First. Uh, the great Abraham Lincoln was called a baboon, an original gorilla. Let's see, an idiot. Basically, he was maligned by members of his cabinet, members of the general staff. I mean, Lincoln doesn't become the great Abraham Lincoln until after he's shot down by Booth. Though things were turning in that favor already, but when Booth kills him, that makes him kind of a sainted man. Somebody else who was probably not the smartest man in the room but makes a great president, George Washington. Another man who was a very good president, may not have been the smartest man in the room, but had a lot of intellect and a lot of ability, was two men I'll give you out of the 20th century, is Harry Truman, no college education, but really a good president. Had like good sense and a good feel of things of what right to do and what not to do. Same thing for the man who follows him, Dwight Eisenhower. People will laugh at those two men, and then you've come out to find later that no, they might not have been the smartest men in the world, but they actually knew what they were doing. So, and they did a good job. So, Adams, if IQ matters, Adams should have been a great president. If resume matters, Adams should have been a great president, but he wasn't. He wasn't. What the problem was is that this is true for him and his father. And you would think, being a diplomat, Adams would have learned politics a little bit better, but he didn't. All those Adamses seem to have some sort of a righteous streak in them, but it's a different sort of righteous streak. Jackson could be offended and believe that he was wronged, and I guess the Adams could too. But Jackson knew how to. Well, he didn't get mad. Jackson didn't get mad. He got ahead, got even. The Adamses would get mad, and they never got ahead, and they never got even. So the problem with Adams is that he did not play politics well. He did not slap you on the back well. Jackson could do that. He could really turn the charm on and do all that glad handing that a congressman and a senator really love. Adams, he thought it should be a dang debating society and that it all ought to just work according to plan. And on top of that, Adams thought they should establish some various things like pay for public roads and bridges in a large scale, which today is not controversial at all. And so, in that sense, Adams was right, but he was probably 50, 75 years, maybe more of 100 years ahead of his time. The next thing he wanted to do was Adams, wanted to establish a national university. If you want to think about it, instead of having the University of Texas, you would also have the University of the United States. The United States was not ready for that, and frankly, probably wouldn't be ready for it today because you've got plenty of universities, got plenty of colleges out there, and that's pretty much a state matter. But Adams pushed for it, and Jackson's friends, excuse me, are going to chase Adams pretty hard over the subject. Anyways, moving along, and then you have that. And last, there's several other things. I'll just make it brief. He wanted to establish a naval observatory, or not naval, but a observatory to look at the stars. Anyways, great ideas. But for his time in which he lived, he was too far beyond the pale, and he came across as kind of this caviar eating, wine drinking sort of guy. He's not rough and ready. He does not. He looks like, and frankly, in a sense, true. He didn't like to knock back a bourbon every so often. Uh, he just doesn't fit in well in the office. He's a great diplomat, but he just was beyond the pale as a politician. Just did not make it. So Jackson, more particularly his friends, Jackson's friends are going to run circles around Adams as as president, and make his time as president miserable. Uh, Adams Adams is going to be a one-term president, one term, and that's it. And then you have the Great Election of 1828. That is one of the nastiest, dirtiest elections in the history of the United States. In fact, I would argue it is the dirtiest. If you think politics today are bad, you go just listen to this lecture, you'll get what I mean. Today, what ends up happening is someone says, "Oh, so and so, why that man, he's just going to throw women, throw old grannies off the side of the mountain, and to cut the Medicare." They have no imagination. Or someone says, uh, they're they're just a bunch of Nazis. Oh, come on. Do better than that. Now, in the election of 1828, boy, the mud got deep and nasty, and it got after it fast. There was none of this argument. We're going to talk about the issues of the day. We're going to debate this, and we're going to give all these great ideas for the people, and we're going to take it. No, this is who do you like and who do you trust? Who do you like and who do you trust? First thing is that let's just start off. If I were you, put into your notes two names: Jackson on the one hand, Adams on the other. Okay, so there you go. Because it's going to get dirty and nasty. So just bear with me. I'm just don't shoot the messenger here. I'm just a storyteller from history. Jackson's campaign is going to say some nasty things about the president of the United States. First things first, they said he was a thief. So that's number one on your list of why don't you vote for old what's his name? Because he's a thief. Old Adams is a thief. He stole the election of 1824. The Lord knows what else he stole while he was in the White House. Oh my gosh, you can't trust a man like that. The corrupt bargain rides again. So that was number one. Number two, they said that Adams, Jackson's Jackson's friend, said that Adams was, to use the high-powered word, he was effete. But what that really means, when you call somebody they're effete, basically what you're saying is he's not man enough to be president of the United States. Not he won't fight for you. He won't stand up and do. He won't defend the nation. He's probably wearing silk underwear. I mean, Lord have mercy. What type of you want a guy like that? This is what Jackson's people would have said. You want a guy like that as president of the United States wearing silk underwear and all that sort of business? He's probably having fancy parties in the White House. No, sir. You don't want to vote for a guy like that. He is too refined. He's probably drinking champagne and eating caviar. That's not the president we need here in the United States. So Jackson and Jackson's friends will be saying nasty things about Adams as far as his ability to carry on. In addition to that, they said that Jackson, that I keep getting this all mixed up. I'm sorry. It's late in the evening. It's 8:50, and I'm lecturing still. Huh. Anyways, Adams's people said that I can't get it right now. Jackson's people said that Adams was a gambler. That's right. Write that down. Adams was a gambler, and you know what? Adams established and put into the White House gambling devices. And who knows, maybe there were half-naked women dancing the hula in there too. There were gambling devices in the pit of the White House. He has turned the White House into a den of iniquity. Can you elect a man like that? Don't take a chance. Don't vote for John Quincy Adams. Oh my gosh. Oh, horrors, horrors, horrors. Now you're saying to yourself, "Oh my, Mr. Giselaw, that's horrible." What did he do? What did he write down? Well, what did he put into the basement of the White House? Was it a one-armed bandit? A one-armed bandit. My grandfather always called it that. You know, that slot machine goes, you pull it down, takes your money, you're holding your hands up. Oh, I hope it, no, it just takes your money. Ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. No, it was not a one-armed bandit. Now you're saying, okay, fine. What about a roulette wheel? Maybe a roulette wheel. No. Craps tables. No. Well, what type of thing was it? Okay, Vanna White and a Wheel of Fortune. No. No, Wheel of Fortune and no antique Vanna White when she was young. So the fact of the matter is, what was it? It was two things. One, let's see if I can get my hand right. One, it was a billiard table, aka a pool table. Two, it was a chessboard. But remember, in this era, you don't have the ability to call in the press. You don't have ability to make a real good counterpoint. Besides, I mean, he's stolen elections before. He wears silk underwear. I mean, what else do you expect from the guy? He probably is gambling in the White House. You can't trust these sorts of guys. And he's from Massachusetts. So Jackson's people then went a step further. Jackson's friend said not only was Adams was a gambler and he was a he was a thief, they said that President John Quincy Adams was also a pimp. That's right, I said it. That the President of the United States, when Adams, was a minister plenipotentiary, probably said that word wrong, but he was a diplomat to the Tsar of Russia, had taken an American virgin and taken her to Russia in exchange for the Tsar's signature on a piece of paper in a trade agreement. That the President of the United States was nothing less than a pimp. That's dirty. Now you start seeing that sort of stuff flying around an election in 2016, you know you got something, folks. I mean, we're talking real deal, raw knuckle sort of thing. So you're probably thinking, my gosh, that's horrible. Jackson shouldn't have said that and should have reined his people in. And you're probably also thinking John Quincy Adams was a good man and he would not have said anything against Jackson and he would not have stooped to any sort of mudslinging level. Now, if you thought that, you don't know the Adamses. They could throw the mud with the best of them. And Adams's boys gave as good as they got. The first thing they said about Jackson was you cannot, oh my gosh, you cannot elect Andrew Jackson because he is going to be a Caesar and a wild man. There were variations of it, but basically they called him a Caesar of the hillbillies, a potential king, a barbarian king of the hillbillies, come out of Tennessee, and you can insert your banjo music here. So that's one thing. And on top of that, they said that he not only was he was a Caesar in the making. Jackson can't even spell his own name. Now, Jackson could spell his own name. I know that. I've seen it. But This is where Jackson's politics and his friends were better at politics than Adams's were. Now, it's true. I have said it in class. Jackson and the English language weren't always the best of friends. But Jackson's people turned it around and used it to their advantage. And it goes like this: Adams can write, but Jackson will fight. And it's the implicit question of, who do you want to be president? A man who can write nasty letters to the enemies of the United States, or a man who can fight and has defeated the enemies of the United States and will fight for the United States again if need be? All Jackson had to do was turn his face, and you saw that scar. All he had to do, all he had to do was say New Orleans. Where was Jackson? He was fighting. What was Adams doing? He was writing. Who are you going to vote for? A president who will defend the nation, or a president who will write for the nation? It was an effective counter punch by Jackson's people. But Adams's folks were not done yet. They said that not only was Jackson a wild man and wasn't even educated and on from there, they said that Jackson, this is a pretty good one, Jackson was a murderer. He was a murderer. He was a murderer. And that Jackson, in fact, they pump out what are called the coffin handbills. The coffin handbills. And what it was is there was I think there was about a half a dozen black coffins on top of a handbill, which was like in 1828 America, a pamphlet that you handed out to at political rallies, and you passed out and you mailed out. And it goes like this: the nefarious deeds of General Jackson and all the men he has killed in his lifetime. So we've established Jackson was not afraid of violence. He did have a few bullets in his body. Yeah, you get the picture. So Jackson did have a wild and unruly past, and Adams's boys, they do go after it, and so they say that. But last but not least, I cannot lay this out, and I cannot leave it aside. It gets extra personal with Adams's people toward Jackson. They first said about Jackson, said that Jackson's mother, I'm sorry to say it like this, but Jackson's mother was a prostitute. And that she was not just any sort of prostitute, but a common whore who serviced British soldiers during the American Revolution. That was, whoa. That was nasty and cold. Then Adams's people went on to say that Jackson's father was a mulatto slave, and out of that unholy alliance, union, comes Andrew Jackson. You can't trust his lineage. Look how rough and hewn. I mean, my gosh, my gosh. And last but not least, Adams's people said Jackson was a polygamist. Jackson was a bigamist, meaning that he was married to a woman, in this case, of course, Rachel, that was married to a woman who had multiple husbands. Now that is an election. When it's all said and done, Jackson wins in a landslide. And most of the polite people of Washington, D.C., the great intellectual lights of Washington, D.C., wasn't a big town back then, run out of town. They're afraid, oh my gosh, the mob is going to take us over. The mob is here and their king is with them. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So they bail out of town and they get down the road. But Jackson wins in a landslide, and it was a nasty, nasty election in 1828. By the way, that business about Jackson being a bigamist, there is actually a little bit of truth to that in a technical sense. The fact is that Lewis Robards or rather Rachel, got a self-divorce, as I described in class. She declared herself divorced, and everybody in the community accepted it. But frankly, legally, they weren't divorced. They weren't, Lewis and Rachel Robards were not divorced, and so they had to go through that process there, and it was in a sense technically true. So it was nasty, it was harsh, and it was hard. And Jackson, some of you may think, well, why didn't Jackson challenge Adams to a duel? Because that's not what you do at this level. It's okay perhaps earlier on in life when you're in the early 1800s, but here you are in 1828. It's not what a 60-year-old man does who wants to be president. So Jackson gets elected president. Now he's got to get himself ready to move to Washington, D.C., and this is the next twist in the story for Andrew Jackson in his life. Um, Jackson and his friends had purposely kept Rachel out of the loop. They had kept her in the dark about all that was being said about her. And as I said, it was pretty nasty. And about December 24th, 23rd, just right around Christmas time, 1828, Rachel is walking the streets with some friends, but mostly by herself, in fact. She's walking the streets of Nashville after, taking care of odds and ends. She's actually shopping for dresses and such for the inaugural ball, for the move to Washington to become the first lady, on and on and on. And she's also saying her goodbyes. As the story goes, Rachel was stopping by an old friend's of theirs, a place, an old friend's, I guess you call it, a newspaper shop. That's what it was, print shop. Excuse me. And uh, and she's sitting there waiting for this editor to get back and meet with her. I mean, I think he was out of the office for a second. He'd just be right back. And she's thumbing through some old papers that were laying around there in the office in the newspaper shop. And she comes across this article describing her relationship with Andrew Jackson in very unflattering terms. All that stuff I just told you about. And it just broke her heart. And she starts to weep. She starts to wail. And she goes back to the Hermitage, and she is absolutely crushed by what was said about her. Unfortunately for Rachel Jackson, in 1828, she was not in good health. She was in fairly bad shape physically and health wise. And in fact, actually, for some time, it was a known fact that she had a bad heart. But in that era, medicine is very primitive, as you well know, because when I talked about Jackson's medicine treatments of mercury and lead, the doctors prescribed for Rachel to kind of calm her nerves a regimen of smoking. She would literally sit every night and take smoke a pipe. And but for her, a woman of her stature, a woman of her pedigree, a woman of her position, was that was one of the worst things you could do was go smoke a pipe. It would be like some being a debutante or some sort of high society type in Houston who was told by the doctor every night to go get a crack pipe and smoke. It doesn't work. It makes sense. They of course you understand this about smoking tobacco in 1828 or 29 America. They don't know that it causes cancer. They don't know that it causes emphysema. They have some ideas that it does. It's already being called a cigarette would already be called a coffin nail by the U.S. Civil War. But they certainly did not know that it causes and accelerates heart disease. I mean, that's one of the byproducts of smoking cigarettes is heart disease. And she wailed and she wept, and we're not talking silent weeping. We're talking about violent weeping, loud weeping, just would not stop. And first, she did this for evidently about a day or so, a couple of days, and what had happened was it brought on a massive heart attack and it killed her. She was very obese, and she was not in good health. And right before they were supposed to leave for the White House for Washington D.C., Rachel Jackson is dead. I bring this up to tell you this too is that Jackson himself is distraught. You could hear him wailing, and he was crushed. It was the love of his life was gone, and now he's going to go to Washington alone. And he didn't go to the funeral. He just could not bear to see her carried away and buried. The man who is going to lead the procession of the funeral mourners, the mourners for this event for Rachel at the funeral, going to lead the procession is Sam Houston. Sam Houston in 1828 is governor of Tennessee and a very close friend of the Jacksons, politically and personally. And so Sam Houston leads the procession for Rachel to her tomb. She's buried in a rose garden off the grounds of the Hermitage. If you ever go there, and I really hope if you travel to Nashville, I hope you do, you should travel to the Hermitage and you should see it. She is buried there next now to Andrew, right next to each other there in her beloved rose garden. And Jackson was in deep mourning. Jackson takes the oath of office in March of 1830. Excuse me, 1830, March of 1829. And one of the things that people feared was there would be a lot of folks come see the president or president-elect put into office. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Thousands, in fact, about 15 to 20,000 of Jackson's supporters showed up in Washington, D.C. to see their hero. In fact, another nickname he picks up in his time period, they called him the hero of the common man. Jackson is going to take the oath of office, and a lot of folks go to the Capitol building there in D.C. to watch him take the oath. But not everybody went to the Capitol building. Several thousand folks evidently decided to go to the White House directly. This is an era when you don't have nearly the security you have today. Today, 1,000 folks show up at the White House. They call them the National Guard and the Army. Back then, it doesn't happen. But people started milling around the White House. They got into the White House. They tore down the drapes. They tore up the carpets. They broke up the furniture. They broke the plates. They drank all the whiskey and booze, or not all of it. They tried to. And it was a raucous riot. By the time Jackson gets to the White House, everybody's good and liquored up, and they're in a frenzy to see the great man, see the great president, see the great general. And so a lot of folks are wanting to touch him and to lay hands on him. And Jackson actually has to escape the White House by being let out the second-story window, so he could get away. Now, what do you have to take away from this? If you ever have a party, I'll tell you this just right up front. If you ever have a party at your apartment and you want to get rid of somebody, get them out of the apartment, and get them away from there, do what perhaps you consider, maybe not should do, but consider what the White House staff did, which was take the booze out into the yard, and guess what? The partygoers follow where the alcohol is. They locked the door and posted a guard there, the partygoers, to keep them out of the White House. White House was wrecked. Took them a month or so to get it cleaned up and get into order again. Jackson had to live in a hotel room for a couple of days. That's that. But that's President Jackson. He's now in office. One of the men I do want to. I don't think I told you about this, and if I did, you might as well go ahead and just you can stop right now or whatever. But one of the men you probably ought to make note of here, who served both Jackson and Adams is a diplomat, is a fellow named Joel Roberts Poinsett. Joel Roberts Poinsett. Joel Poinsett is not really known to most Americans now. Joel Poinsett is, however, known to some, in fact, a good number of Mexican scholars. And anyways, as far as Joel Poinsett is concerned, what makes him important is that his relationship with Mexico and the United States is integral to understanding the time period we're discussing. Poinsett's from South Carolina. He is a planter, and he's of the planter class like Jackson. He owns slaves, that sort of fun stuff. But in addition to that, Poinsett had some avocations. He had some hobbies, and one of his hobbies was he was an amateur botanist. Loved floras and faunas and all that sort of fun thing. So Poinsett was appointed by President Adams to go down to Mexico and be the chief representative, the chief diplomat of the United States in Mexico City. And Poinsett is going to make a whole lot of mistakes and going to make a whole lot of enemies. Part of the problem with the Poinsett is he got to play in local politics, and generally speaking, a diplomat probably ought to stay out of the local political situation. And really, not only just stay out of it, I mean, sometimes he has to involve himself, that's that, but generally stay out of it. But not Poinsett, he doesn't. He gets involved in local Mexican politics. He picks sides, makes enemies. However, I'd write this down, and because you'll hear me talk more about it again, is that Mexican politics of this era is really dominated by the Masonic Lodge. The Freemasons are major players in Mexican politics. One group is called the Yorkinos, Yorkino, the Yorkino, and the other is called the Escoceses. The Escoceses, let me see if I can write this down and hold it up. Let's see if that, there you go, Escoceses. How's that for technology? I wrote it on a legal on a pad. Anyways, the Escoceses are another Masonic body. Basically, Yorkino stands for York Rite. Escoceses stands for Scottish Rite. Anyways, those are the two major political parties in Mexico in the 1820s and early 1830s. You probably ought to know them because they'll show on that final. I can guarantee you that. I'll talk more about them in a later lecture. But Mexican politics is pretty turbulent. And Poinsett's going to help charter a lot of Masonic lodges in Mexico. His fingerprints are all over that territory there too. But one of the things he has is charged with doing, one of the things he's told to do while he's in Mexico by President Adams and to a certain degree Jackson as well, is to see if the Mexicans would be willing to sell Texas. Now, Adams had signed over Texas in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, but that's not to say that Adams was against picking up Texas in 1820s. In fact, though later he will actually be against it, in the 1820s, Adams was still looking to expand the nation. The problem is Poinsett would get down there and he'd talk to the presidents of Mexico and kind of muck it up a little bit. The first president of Mexico, this was in that question on the exam. I thought it was a good question because it was a book question, is a fellow named Guadalupe Victoria. Guadalupe Victoria, first president of Mexico. And Guadalupe Victoria is not a bad fellow. And he's really an honest Mexican. Is a really good president. I think very highly of him historically. But Poinsett would get to badgering him about, would you like to sell Texas? Would you like to sell Texas? Would you like to sell Texas? And it would be the equivalent, because you got to remember, Texas is a backwater. Texas is attached to the state of Coahuila. And I don't think I said it right, Coahuila, for my English or Spanish. And Texas is a small state. We're a backwater. It's the equivalent of trying to sell Alaska without oil. There's no oil in Alaska at the time, or no oil in Texas at the time, or it's not discovered yet. It's basically far away, and so on. Now, most Americans, I say this, but there are students I've asked over the years, would you sell North Dakota? Would you sell the plains of Montana and Wyoming? Leave the mountains here. Would you sell South Dakota? And there are students who will say, some of you might say this too, is like, yep, I'd sell it. I'd sell it. It's for sale. Sell it out of here. But most Americans probably would object and say, no, no, no. North Dakota, I'll never go there, but North Dakota is a part of the United States. It's America. Mexicans had the same sort of pride in Texas in that sense. They're like, no, we're not going to sell Texas. It's been part of Mexico since Cortez. And so Poinsett would badger and plead and push and cajole, and finally he got himself kicked out of the country. The word or the phrase when you get kicked out of a country in diplomatic circles is persona non grata. You aren't welcome here anymore. And Poinsett, after he's gotten kicked out, I believe it was in 29 that he gets kicked out. Poinsett, maybe even 30, but anyways, Poinsett decided, you know what, if I'm getting out of here, if I'm getting kicked out of here, I might as well take something with me. So he and a couple of his buddies, they slip out in the nighttime, and they go and crawl over the wall of the Imperial Palace, the old Aztec Imperial Palace, Viceregal Imperial Palace in downtown Mexico City, where there was an imperial garden, and there were imperial flowers in there. A lot of different flowers of which he had seen before and which he'd liked, none of them in the United States. So he decided to start, he stole a bunch of flowers and mailed them back to Mexico in the diplomatic pouch. Well, one of those flowers is a red flower, and now, to my understanding, it does not actually flower in the Christmas season. You might check me on that. Maybe it does. But I do know this. He sent it to the New York Botanical Society, and they were so impressed by the flower that they had gave it a name and changed it out of the Aztec name, and they gave it the name of poinsettia. So this Christmas, you can amaze your family and friends when you see them and that they ask, what did you learn in school? You can say, I learned why the poinsettia is named for it. He was a failed diplomat who made the Mexicans mad and made them distrust the United States. That's the story of Joel Poinsett. So I think that's a good place to stop. I've got 53 minutes. And they always say with these sorts of recordings that 50 minutes, an hour is about the most you should do. So I think and it's already 9:15 in the evening. I'm tired. Time to stop. You have a good day. We'll see you on Monday.